this is a drawing that you're watching now that is probably the oldest surviving drawing of Leonardo da Vinci. It was drawn in 1473. It depicts a Tuscan landscape, maybe near Vinci, where Leonardo was born. And it's considered to be, apart from being the first surviving Leonardo drawing, it's considered to be the first landscape in Western art. A landscape that is drawn not as a backstage for a religious scene or for a portrait, as it was customary at the time. This is the first time, at least recorded history, where a landscape is drawn just for the sake of it. And you can see that it's drawn quite quickly, but with a precise hand, and you can see the hills, the trees, little villages, castles, and water. Water is something that would fascinate Leonardo all through his life. What is also interesting is that behind the drawing, in Leonardo's typical backward writing, is this phrase, "I, staying with Antony, am happy." And he was referring to his grandfather, Antony. Because in fact, it was his grandparents who grew him, even though his parents were both alive. But this fact is a key factor to understand his upbringing and his very original way of thinking. Let's see. You know that we have just barely started our presentation, but Leonardo's extraordinary story is already taking us in. And truly, Leonardo da Vinci is an extraordinary figure. His name is enough to conjure up a kaleidoscope of images that have become icons of our times. The Mona Lisa, the Last Supper, of course, the Lady with an Ermine, and all the anatomical studies of Leonardo, his inventions, the parachute, the wings to fly. When he was still alive, he was considered not only to be a genius in art, but also a masterpiece of nature. I mean, himself, the man. Every contemporary biographer, there were a few, not many actually, but the few that describe him tell this, all they tell the same story, that he was a beautiful man in appearance, but also a beautiful man to be in company with. He was engaging, was elegant, had a fascinating ability to enchant and entertain his audience. They could listen for hours to his reasoning, his stories, and he was also a great musician, for example. He could play the lira. He could compose and sing improvised verses on the spot. And you can see through these many aspects why every powerful man of the time wanted him by his side as a precious jewel to have in the kingdom or wherever. Raphael, you see here, this is a famous fresco that is at the Vatican now. Raphael painted this fresco when Raphael was younger than Leonardo, but they were both living at the same time. And he was asked by the Pope, Julius II, to paint his apartment, his personal apartment. And in this fresco here, which is titled The School of Athens, there are the greatest philosophers of all time. And Raphael had put the faces of famous people of his time. There's Michelangelo, there are other famous painters and architects. But he put at the center of the scene the greatest philosopher of all, of course, which is Plato. And the face of Plato is, of course, that of Leonardo. And he was already like it seems like he knew how to market himself. He had an aspect, an appearance that was unique. He had long hair and also a long beard, and nobody used both. Either you had a long beard or a long hair, not both, but he did, so everyone immediately knew how he looked like. The King of France, Francis I, wanted him in France. He took him when he was very old, and he wanted him all for himself, even though Leonardo had stopped painting just because he wanted to be near such a person and to spend his time conversing with him. He thought that Leonardo was the greatest mind that ever lived. And according to legend, this is just a legend, Leonardo died in the embrace of the king in France. And this is no other possible way to die for such a personality, but it's a legend. On that day, the king was away, was not near the place. But the legends actually started right after Leonardo's death in 1519. Next year is going to be 500 years since Leonardo's death. This is an anniversary that is not going to come back very, very soon. And he was transformed into a real-life, godlike figure right away. Giorgio Vasari, you can see him here, he was not a great painter, but he was the first art historian. He was the first to tell the story of painters and architects. And this is his famous book, De Vite dei più eclatanti pittori, and the lives of the most extraordinary painters, and so on. And he had never met Leonardo. When Leonardo died, he was only 8 years old. But I had the chance to meet many that knew Leonardo, disciples, friends. And in his book, he gives a portrait of Leonardo where he almost appears as a supernatural being. These are his own words. Listen. The greatest gifts are often seen in the course of nature, rained by celestial influences on human creatures. And sometimes, in supernatural fashion, beauty, grace, and talent are united beyond measure in one single person, in a manner that to whatever such an one turns his attention, his every action is so divine that, surpassing all other men, it makes itself clearly known as a thing bestowed by God, as it is, and not acquired by human art. This was seen by all mankind in Leonardo da Vinci. So for Vasari, and for many others after him, if Leonardo had so many talents, it was thanks to the celestial influences, because God himself chose him and favored him. Later, in the 19th century, there would be others seriously considering the possibility that Leonardo had signed a pact with the devil. Seriously. But for those that do not believe in supernatural intervention, a fundamental question remains. How could Leonardo become an immortal figure, still recognized today, 5 centuries after his death, as the symbol of universal genius? What was his way of thinking that made him so original? A defining trait, I think, is his tendency to go upstream. He was an illegitimate son. As I said, he was born in Vinci. His father was a notary public. He had an adventure with a local girl from the country, and she remained pregnant, but he was going to marry the daughter of a rich merchant in Florence, so he could not stay with the girl. But he accepted the baby, and he had his parents raise him in Vinci. But again, since he was an illegitimate son, he could not get an academic education. Illegitimate kids could not follow the course of studies of their parents if they were not legitimate. And this is one trait. He was also very elegant, as I said, did not follow fads. When the fashion was to have long skirts, he would have short. He was left-handed. And that's why he wrote from right to left, not because he had to hide who knows what, just because that was the simpler way to write without smearing the page with the ink. He was a homosexual, which at the time was very common, even the Pope. I mean, it's not very difficult to find, but it was considered to be something against the law of God. So you could be punished with death. And he was also a vegetarian. Probably the first vegetarian recorded in Western history. There is an interesting letter from a traveler that went to the Far East and wrote back to Italy and said, oh, I found a group of people here who do not kill animals to eat. And they only eat vegetables or whatever, just like our own Leonardo da Vinci in Italy. So it really seems to be the portrait of everything that was opposite to what was considered to be proper behavior in his times. And probably today there still are some who would greatly disapprove of him. But it is this characteristic, the fact that he did not go with the flow and was quite secure in his choices, that made him unique. And above all, even before science became what we know it to be today, he was already a scientist. It may be worth understanding what it means to go against the flow in science. What makes a genius rather than a mere mortal, or worse, a fool? Think of Mozart or Van Gogh, as you can see them here, as artists who have revolutionized music, the canons in music and painting. In the art, genius has often been associated with an idea of opposition by the artist to the canons of society. The examples abound, of course. Picasso, Jackson Pollock, Elvis Presley, the Beatles. So often, in art, a good artist is a rebel. And what about science? Well, in science, as you know, it appears to be a more rational and cautious activity compared to the arts. The link between rebellion and the scientific creativity is maybe even more revolutionary in truth. When Galileo said that the Earth was not the center of the universe, and that it was not true that the cosmos gravitated around it, he was not going against fashions or old habits. He was going against very strong beliefs that had cemented in the course of 2,000 years of history. Aristotle had stated how the universe worked, and his ideas had been repeated for 2,000 years, until Galileo and Copernicus, with their telescopes, had demonstrated that he was wrong. Or think about Charles Darwin, whose discoveries further contributed to demolish the image of special creature that man had painted for himself. And the reactions to such revolutionaries were not mere critiques. Galileo was put under inquest by the Inquisition and was forced to recant in order to have his life saved. Darwin was luckier, for in this time the Inquisition had been abolished. What is important, however, is that their discoveries have been validated and their value confirmed by those that came after them. And this not only gave them the strength to such, not only gave strength to such discoveries, but established a fact that is central to science, that is the idea that the words of an authority have no value unless they are backed up by facts. Facts that are verifiable and repeatable, and they are the only things that matter. Plato, the real one, not the depiction of Leonardo, used to say that scientific truths are eternal and never change. It is not so. As we know, they're considered true until they are shown to be false by contrary experience. And here is why Leonardo represents a fascinating example of someone who understood this principle long before many others did. He admitted he was a man with no letters, meaning that he did not have a proper academic history education. He had been an apprentice at the Verrocchio's shop in Florence, where other kids by the names like of Domenico Ghirlandaio or Sandro Botticelli, which are some of the greatest painters of the Renaissance, were learning the art. But his lack of proper codified education had been really his luck. He called himself a disciple of experience. He used to say that every argument that is not born from experience is vain. He wrote, "Avoid the rules stated by those who do not confirm their ideas with experience. Nothing that has not been demonstrated by facts can bring any good to man or to his progress. It's not modern. This is the reason why he rarely was wrong, because he never forced facts to accord to the hypothesis that he cared about. Instead, he let the experience show him the way. An example of this way of thinking is in his studies on water, in particular, the circulation of water on Earth. In one of his manuscripts, the manuscript named F, dated 1508, he opens the manuscript with an analogy between the small world of man, the microcosmos, and the big world of the Earth, the macrocosmos. He writes, "Similarly to man and animals, the body of the Earth is crossed by veins, the waters, that nourish the land and its creatures." He had gotten this analogy by Vitruvius, who was the great architect and engineer in the Roman Empire. And it was an analogy that agreed with the idea, with the vision that man was at the center of everything at Leonardo's time. A fascinating idea, but experience was ready to prove otherwise. Leonardo was not one who used to repeat what others said in the past, but he wanted to understand and to check it for himself. So if he was comparing man and Earth, he had to know exactly how man and Earth worked. He did so with the anatomies of dead bodies. He actually dissected over 30 bodies in his life until he was stopped by the Pope, because it was considered to be immoral. And to understand the nature of the Earth, he explored caves inside the mountains, he went on top of mountains, collected fossils, and by the way, was among the first to understand that they were not proof of the universal flow, which he did not believe in, but rather proof that the surface of the Earth was very different in ancient times, and when water was where now are mountains. And so since the facts that he is able to ascertain with his work show him that this analogy between man and Earth is untenable and does not correspond with reality, since water does not go back up mountains like the blood continually flows inside the body, he abandons this idea and tries other ways of reasoning. And eventually, by the end of the manuscript, and this is the interesting thing, we find that his reasoning, his ideas, his experiments take him to what we now know is the correct answer. Water reaches the mountains because it evaporates from the sea and then raising in the air, forming clouds, and then coming back to the Earth as rain. The fact that he did not satisfy himself with the most comfortable explanations, but he was constantly searching for truth, putting every hypothesis to the test, allows us to consider Leonardo a precursor of the scientific method, as it will be later stated by Galileo and Descartes. At the end of his life, he leaves Italy. As I said, the King of France wanted him to himself, and luckily, he was very lucky, because at the time he was in the Vatican and he was ignored. The Pope could not do anything with this man. He wanted a painting, and Leonardo started to study the shadows and the light that would touch the subject, and then he studied, how the kind of paint he was going to use and how that would influence the painting, and it went on and on, studying everything but painting. And so the Pope just wanted the freaking painting, and so he couldn't do anything with this man. So just leave him there, I don't know what. But the King of France understood exactly the genius of Leonardo, so he begged him to go to France, and he gave him this little shack to live, which is still preserved today. And he went only with one disciple, Francesco Melzi, who was with him for 13 years. And he stayed there, a couple of years before dying, actually. When Leonardo dies on May the 2nd, 1519, age 67, this is Francesco Melzi, he leaves all of his manuscripts to Francesco. And he would preserve this manuscript, bring them back to Italy, preserve them all like relics in his house near Milan. But after his death, his kids had had enough of a father who could only talk about Leonardo. Leonardo this, Leonardo that, look at this, Leonardo thought this, Leonardo thought that. So when Francesco died and somebody came to the house asking, is it true that you have the original Leonardo manuscript? Oh, sure, take them, who cares about this stuff, take it away. And so they got dispersed, and more than half of them got lost, and they're never to be found again, which is a pity, of course. And the interesting thing for me, and actually for everybody researching Leonardo, is the fact that he very rarely wrote something about his own life. He wrote about everything. There are thousands of pages, so you can imagine how many more he had written in his own lifetime, about every subject, every possible subject, but very, very rarely about himself. So I thought it would be fascinating one day to find a manuscript written by a person who knew him well, somebody who could also write, like Francesco Menzi, who was also, who had studied, who had a proper academic background. He studied Latin and Greek. He could read both and could write well and was very helpful to Leonardo. So since this manuscript was nowhere to be seen, and I open this personal parenthesis, I invented one. So I wrote it as the story of Leonardo. The idea was not to write another biography, there are so many about him, but to write the story of Leonardo through the eyes of his own disciple, and to see him as a real man, because that's what he was. He was not a supernatural being. He was a real man who had great ideas, had many talents, but also had many difficulties and problems. He was not paid by those who had to pay him, so he had to ask, and there are letters of frustration. There were those who were putting obstacles in front of him, and he could not do his work, like the Pope, for example, impeding his dissection, and so on. He had many, many difficulties, and it is very interesting to read the life of such a genius in a different light. It's also very fun to read about the kid that he adopts, Salai, which was a real devil. Salai means devil in a famous novel of his time. And he writes in his notes, because he was also very careful in taking notes about the money that came out of his pocket. And this Salai frequently stole his money. He was 10 years old, but he was already a thief. And everywhere he took him, Salai broke dishes and windows and stole the money of the people that invited him. So it's something that you usually don't find in a biography. So he's not an eccentric. He's just a regular human being. And before I leave you, I have one more thing to tell you after we finish talking about Leonardo. But I think that there is one apt definition of Leonardo that we can use in closing our brief conversation about him. And it's an image that I think it is very true and was probably very frustrating for him. For we can describe him as a man who woke up very early in the middle of the night, actually too early, while everybody else around him was still asleep. Thank you.
Thanks for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and ring that bell to be notified about new videos. You can follow us on social media, and if you really love what we do, consider supporting us with a donation. Links to all that good stuff is in the description below.